On the World Bank, I haven't spoken much about the World Bank since I left, but since we're now into another presidency, I thought I'd share a few more thoughts on this. And Marcus's starting point gives me the foundation for a message that I want to convey more broadly, which is that traditionally the economics and finance profession tend to focus on the bank as a lending institution. And therefore, they tend to feel that the loans, as economists would say, are a scarce good, so it's a question of allocation. And understandably, this then leads people to say, look, the bank should just be focusing on the poorest countries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. There's clearly a very critical role for sub-Saharan Africa, but in contrast to the idea that the bank or the regional development banks don't have a role, in some ways I think the challenges now are greater than ever before. And let me give you some specifics to try to get a little feel for this. All you have to do is open the newspaper and you come to some recognition that Central America seems to be in the news. So one of the issues that I would think would be for the World Bank would be to take its expertise in combining issues of security, dealing with crime, governance, and development, and apply it to Central America with the Inter-American Development Bank and others. Iraq, and so one deals with ISIS, but then the question is, what's the future reconstruction of Iraq? Same set of questions. Afghanistan, the future of Afghanistan. So one, there's a whole category across different continents of fragile post-conflict states that are more than a challenge of pure economic development. They're this combination of stability, security, governance, and economics. And the bank has developed some competence and experience in this along with others. A related category would be to take a country such as Saudi Arabia, which is very important for the international system, would be higher income and not necessarily in need of borrowing, but is in the midst of critical economic reforms. And they're going to be fundamental to the future of the Middle East. Well, you can hire outside consultants to do PowerPoints, as they did, or you can try to actually bring in some institutions that for 30 or 40 years have had some substantial experience in dealing with these transitions. Now, the important point is, notice I'm saying it doesn't have to be done through loans. This can be done through reimbursable contract arrangements, and so it's the knowledge function. Or if we take the challenges, as you read in the paper about India, Brazil, Mexico, middle-income countries, as Zhu Min was saying. What most people have recognized is the real big challenges for development in those countries are going to be at the state level. So they're federal systems. And the capacity at the state level is quite weak compared to what's been developed at the federal side. So one of the challenges will be, what have we learned about sort of what works in developing capacity and governance at the state level, which can be done with loans, but can be done with other processes. If I think about a whole set of different challenges in the international system, take girls and women and their role in society. How are you going to grow if you ignore 50% of your public? If I take the challenges of organized crime and and corruption, which you, again, all you have to do is open the paper, look at how important they are. The bank can play a role not only with its own work, but frankly in supporting the efforts of these sort of very fragile groups with judicial systems, prosecutors, and others. And the bank has done some of this with something called the Corruption Hunters Alliance. Open data. One of the things that we started at the bank was to kind of opening all our data resources. Then we started to work with countries to see how it could expand their transparency, expand the connection to social media. Issues of natural disasters. We've learned a lot about what you can do to predict them, offset some, prevent some of the damages, and certainly have resilience and recovery, which, by the way, is quite important in the development process. I could go on, but my major point, Marcus, on this is that when you think about the bank as an institution, in some ways the flaw is it's called bank. And so people think that its primary role is lending. In fact, its primary role is taking not only knowledge, but combining it with the experience on the ground. So this is where it goes beyond the sort of the university knowledge or the controlled experiments that come out of the MIT lab and others, and try to understand how do you really sort of make a difference? And in practical terms, in a good year, if you take all the banks financing, IDA, IFC, IBRD, trust funds, it's maybe $60 to $70 billion a year. Now that's not small money, but compared to international capital markets, it's a drop in the bucket. So the real challenge would be, how do you use those projects to have a demonstration effect that has sort of ripple effects sort of more broadly in the international system? And where the bank does have additional capacity is it has different financial means. The IDA, which is now up to $17, $18 billion a year, are either grants or almost no interest loans. Then there's IFC, which is the private sector financing. Then there's IBRD. IBRD loans, given current interest rates, aren't much better than sort of you might get in the marketplace, but they're much longer term. So in terms of being able to sort of stabilize your situation. Then a lot of countries rely on the bank to manage trust funds or whatever the set of issues. So the concluding strategic point, and this is what's often missed in discussions of the bank, is that it's part of a thin multilateral veneer that you have, or fabric. So you got the IMF, you got the World Bank, you got regional development banks, you got some of the UN operating agencies. And in a sense, the way to best see them is catalytic problem solvers. How they can draw together private sector, civil society, sort of governments, and some of their own capacity to try to address issues. And this has a very important corollary. Some of the discussions that you'll hear about the World Bank or the regional development banks suggest that, well, under this scarcity of economic resources, you really shouldn't work with middle-income countries anymore. The focus should just be on the poorest. That would create, in my view, a very unfortunate asymmetry where you just got the developed countries, the poorest countries, and you leave the middle-income countries out of the system. Now, not only are there challenges of development and security and other things for middle-income countries, but the goal should be, how do they contribute? So whether it's going to be climate change, whether it's local security issues, whether it's trade finance systems, whether it's the topics that Minju talked about, you have to figure out how to engage the middle-income countries to be beneficiaries as well as contributors. And by the way, it's true for some of the developed countries too. Some of the work the bank was doing on natural disaster work was actually quite useful also for Australia and Japan as they're sort of considering it. So the prime message that I kind of wanted to relay is, as the bank is now rebooting, it's going to have a new president. There's actually a huge set of opportunities here for David Malpass and the team and the board and the member states to sort of consider, separate from the whole question of, at some point we're going to have a recession. And one other interesting topic is, a lot of the work that, or the sort of the retrospectives of the financial crisis 10 years afterwards have been quite interesting. They've all focused on developed countries and central banks. And they ignore the critical story of what happened with the developing countries, not only sort of the Chinese sort of expansion, but the effects on trade finance and the resiliency of the system. And if we ignore those lessons, the next time that there's going to be a crisis, and there'll be one, we'll be much worse off.
So you mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, Saudi Arabia, middle-income countries. We just spent an hour talking about China. Should the bank be active in China? If so, what kind of agenda should it have there?
Yeah, I think the bank should have kind of a multi-dimensional aspect with China. So let me start. Many people may not be aware, but going back to McNamara and Deng Xiaoping in 1980, the bank has had a long relationship with China on the analytics side. And as China's gone through these phases where it's tried to reassess kind of its strategic direction, there was one in the 80s, I think in the 90s, there was a floating seminar down the Yangtze River for days. And then in my tenure, there was the China 2030 report, which we did with the DRC. Coincidentally, Liu He was one of the counterparts who now is in the news as sort of deputy premier. So at a minimum, on the analytical side, the exact things that, in a sense, that Fred was asking, and I couldn't quite hear whether Zhu Min answered from where I was, but take the whole role of state-owned enterprises. That's going to be a critical issue in sort of productivity and kind of future development, the work that Nick Lardy has done. That is a natural for the bank to be able to share experience, not from an ideological framework. You've had different sort of state-owned systems, but to explain sort of what's worked, what hasn't worked, what are the dangers of the system, and frankly, engage people in China on better understanding if they're going to go this route, what might be some of the downsides. But more importantly, there's a question of standards as you move up the higher service sector. And this is where I always have a hard time grasping this. This could be so win-win for the United States and others. I did hear Zhu Min talk about, the increasing role of the service sector. And I remember, every time I go to Korea or sometimes Japan and I look at the productivity statistics that you mentioned, I keep coming back to the point, unless you open up your service sector, you're not going to improve very effectively. I think China's going to learn that lesson, but that could be a win-win in terms of these types of trade negotiations. And then, frankly, we could get into this more. These questions of sort of regional and global systemic issues that Fred put on the table would also be part of the agenda. Now, in terms of the traditional bank role with China, the bank still gave loans to China. And obviously, it's hard to explain to the US Congress, why are we lending money to China? What most people may not recognize is that those loans are very targeted pilot projects where China uses the projects exactly the way I described. They try to test them, they understand thoroughly what's going on, and then based on that, they sort of expand it. But if that's politically unsustainable, why not go to a contract method? So I had started to suggest this to China in 2007 or 8 or 9, and at that point, China still wanted the loans because they felt it created a discipline. But maybe in this environment, you could do it on a contract sort of basis going forward. So then there's the reverse side. Even when I was in office, China was starting to contribute to IDA. And are there ways that China contributes to the system? Jin Lequin was here. Obviously, there's a role for how you're going to cooperate with the Chinese-led institutions like the AIIB, which frankly went and hired a bunch of World Bank people to make sure it got the governance and structure right. So your question really goes to, in some ways, the core topic that I'm interested in, and Fred is that where's the system going to go on this? And frankly, it would be a good example. If you try to disconnect from China, or for that matter, other middle income countries or Brazil or others, you're just going to fragment the international system. And I think the types of problems that we're talking about, whether they be shifts in growth, sort of current account, the macro issues, or the questions of climate, or the issues of fragile states, you're going to have all parties be able to figure out how to contribute.
So I recognize that we have a limited amount of time, and I'm sure there are lots of people in the audience who want to ask questions. So I'll just ask one last question. I can't help but take advantage of the fact you're both the former president of the World Bank and the former USTR. So what could, given the current situation, and indeed you were sort of the father of the Doha development round. Given the current situation, what can the bank do to support the international trade system and support continued openness?
Well, it's when I was at the World Bank, my friend Pascal Lamy was at the WTO. And so this was actually a very strong interest. And kind of building on the basic idea I set out, what I wanted to do in the trade area, just as I wanted to do in conflict states and frankly infrastructure, was to combine enhanced analytical capacity, some of people which Peter's Institute has drawn on, with practical experience in the field about how to make this work, and then support the WTO. And of course, events always drive your agenda. One very important part, kind of again lost in the retrospectives, is that in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, the central banks and the regulatory authorities all of a sudden sort of rediscovered risk, and all of a sudden they wanted to apply a new series of risk metrics and capital requirements that almost choked off trade finance. And when you looked at the effect of the financial crisis, particularly on poor countries, it was through the trade channel. It wasn't through much through the financial channel. So Lamy and I had to kind of really push the financial regulatory institutions to be more sort of alleviating the ability of the financing requirements for trade finance. But more particularly today, if I think about it, look at the one of the few areas that the WTO has reached some agreement on, which is on trade facilitation. Well, trade facilitation is fundamentally a development issue that the bank can work on with countries in a bilateral fashion, and should and would do in a bilateral fashion. Whether it's the United States or whether it's Mexico or Colombia or any other country, if you're going to be open to trade, you have to help with adjustment. So what can you learn about helping countries with adjustment processes? So trade and development and economic growth, I mean, any economist, I mean, the problem is each of these professions tend to move in funnels. And so they tend to sort of just do their analytical work in one category. One of the strengths of the bank, if it works right, is to be able to integrate these together. Now, then there's the analytical work, for example, I think whether Fred mentioned this or Zhu Min, take the service sector negotiations in the WTO, or frankly, take the whole issue of how we're going to deal with data as an asset and how, So the trade community is starting to deal with some of those questions, but the bank could certainly add analytical capacity. This question of state subsidies and whether the nature of state capitalism and so on and so forth. The bank's got, again, capacity to be able to look at a number of those issues and be able to contribute to the process. So going back, Marcus, to your very first question, what I sometimes find sort of frustrating, not just because I'm a former bank president, but when I read these articles that say, oh, well, bank lending is this share of, trillion account, it's no longer relevant. Well, I don't know if you think all the topics I just discussed are irrelevant, but they're certainly in the news.
So I have a whole slew of questions written down that I can ask Bob, but I suspect that you also have questions you would like to ask him. There's a standing mic here, and there should be a roving mic appearing momentarily. So if you have a question, until the roving mic appears, why don't you just step up to that standing mic in the center aisle? And if not, I'll keep on asking questions. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation. And okay.
I think he wants you to move over there.
Well, now we've got.
Oh, we got a roving mic.
Okay, here we go.
I'm Zhang Qi with China's Caixin Media. So my question to Bob is, so Secretary Malpass just took office yesterday, and regarding that, are you concerned, or what does that going to influence multilateralism? As he's coming from administration that is not really support multilateralism. And I know if President Jin from AIIB said their meeting went well, but should China worry about it? Thank you.
So I know David quite well. David worked with me at the Treasury Department in the late 80s with Secretary Baker. And so that was the Canada free trade area and a lot of the efforts we did at trade liberalization. He then came over with us to the State Department in '89, where he was a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Latin America Bureau. And this was, Fred will enjoy this, this was a conscious effort. In the US system, you've got deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and deputy assistant secretaries. And I had the sort of novel idea that one of the deputy assistant secretaries in each regional bureau should have an economic background, so to try to integrate it to policy. And I don't know if Bob Doner's still here. I had the novel idea of having a chief economist come to the, also to the State Department. And so David worked on Latin America, so he's familiar with the debt restructuring issues and sort of other questions. He's obviously gone on in many different directions in his career. A lot of his work has been on the macroeconomic side, but he's a smart person, and I think he understands a lot of things we're talking about for sort of the micro side. As for multilateralism, I would suggest give him a chance, look at what he's in his nomination process. I think he very wisely went out to talk to people, understand interests, try to get a sense of kind of the direction. On the China point, he obviously visited China. I don't know what the nature of their discussions are, but they're the types of things, if they so choose, you could draw from what I mentioned here. Or there's other overlaps. So for example, when we talked with Jean LeQuinn, we mentioned how the AIB had done a good job in transparency, governance, anti-corruption, procurement, linkages. And when I've been in China, I've said to the Chinese leaders, there's a lot of questions about Belt and Road. You have a successful model here in AIB. Why don't you apply those to Belt and Road? And so there's the possibilities of transfer here. So look, he's been appointed by an administration that doesn't necessarily agree with many of the economic views that I hold. But if you take the topics that I mentioned, there would strike me as being a very rich universe, gender equality. I mean, that's kind of, whether it's sort of use of sort of open data, anti-corruption. So there's a big field to pick from. The bank staff, I think, is practiced and wise enough to realize that, it has an opportunity here now to work with a new president to sort of have a sense of direction. Fortunately, I think in the process of coming up with the bank capital increase, he developed a good relationship with Kristalina Georgieva, who had been an earlier colleague of mine before going to the European Commission. She's very well respected in the bank, in the Europe, and globally. So I think they have sort of a good relationship. So time will tell. But one of the reasons that I talk about some of these topics is to try to stir the debate a little bit more broadly than the way I hear it discussed about, the things that the bank should stop doing, or kind of how it should narrow its focus, or kind of to see it in narrow financial lending terms as opposed to sort of broader possibilities.
Well, Fred in his presentation mentioned some figures that suggest that in the not distant future, China will be bigger than the United States and then bigger than all the Western countries put together. And I don't know if that day is going to come. I don't know he wisely did not give a date.
I know, but Fred looks pretty young. He lives a long time. He might see it.
But looking out to the future. I mean, at what point? I'm not impugning at all President Malpass, but at what point do we evolve out of a system of this tradition of American leadership?
Well, obviously, I dealt with this a lot in my own tenure, and so I guess I could see it going different ways. But Mark, I hope you probably agree with this. At a time when the debate is sort of, will the U.S. pull back from things? I'm a little reluctant to suggest, well, the U.S. should give up its leadership role in the one multilateral institution that everybody else allows it to run. And now let's remember here, there's never been an American who heads the IMF, right? There's never been an American, that's UN Secretary General, so notice that nationalities do play a role in these institutions, right? As people who are of a historical bent would know, the amusing thing was the bank, or the Americans wanted to have the IMF, but Harry Dexter White, as the book on Ben Steele's Marshall Plan points out, was identified as a communist spy. And so Truman thought, whoops, I better not sort of put him in the IMF job. So the US got the World Bank as sort of the second best. In my tenure, I kept trying to argue how the World Bank could be primary and also playing the macro game as well as the micro game, but I'll leave that to others. So having said that, I think the bigger issue here is, following the general strategy, is how do you bring more countries into the system, okay? Now, Fred talked about voting rights. And there's always a lot of attention to this, and there's a certain value in it. But I tell you, it can be very much overplayed. Because when I dealt with this at the World Bank, I'll tell you what really happened. We could get more, if you based it on sort of shares and contributions, because remember, the World Bank has to get contributions for things like IDA. China would go up, India would stay about the same, the Africans would get squeezed out. Africans would have less voting shares, okay? Just think about this. If the US has about a 15% voting share in the IMF and World Bank, how big is the US in the world economy? 17, 18%? The US is not going to lose a share. And frankly, in the World Bank, you have to figure out, okay, who makes the contributions to IDA. So for example, the Nordics play a higher role in the World Bank structure than they might sort of in the IMF situation. Seats at the table are important. So we actually added another chair on the board for Sub-Saharan Africa because I felt that was kind of a missing piece. The imbalance on board chairs are really European versus others. And so that's for the Europeans to try to work out. But where I wanted to go beyond this is it's in staffing too. So for example, in my time, we had at the senior levels of the bank, over half the senior officers be from the developing world, and I might add women. Which was kind of unprecedented probably at the time and probably still today. When it came time to the first chief economist from the developing world at the World Bank, that was not an accidental decision, by the way. I mean, and I kind of have seen the IMF sort of move in that direction. That's a plus. There's another dimension that kind of the habitual commentators on this miss, is that it also depends on how you work with the client's countries and sort of how you engage them and see whether they're in charge. And something else that I started, which I hope the bank will look at again was we started to create hubs to deal with knowledge and operations in particular issues. And so we did one in Singapore. I just saw the Singapore finance minister. They're pleased with its operation. It didn't quite accomplish what I wanted it to do in terms of understanding how to move infrastructure into an asset class, another topic. I did another one in Nairobi that was focused on conflict states. And that one kind of was removed by my successor. And I hope that's something that people can sort of come back to. So my point is, there's lots of ways you can draw in developing countries at the poorest level, middle income level, developed countries. And the real challenge for a president of the World Bank is how do you get them all involved? Because you don't, whether it's the United States or whether it's Europe or whether it's Africa or whether it's China, the game here is to get everybody engaged in the institution.
Very good. So now with that obligatory Washington Inside Baseball address, we can go back to the audience, please. And I want to make quite clear your answer is far more than Washington Inside.
No. What's quite interesting about this, and that's why I'm glad you gave me actually a chance on this, is that when I didn't, to be honest, I'd studied development economics, but I didn't come from the pure development economics community. And it's quite interesting when you talk to some of the institutions that they keep working in these narrow channels, okay? And what you're really, one of the things that people miss about the bank, and in my comments are trying to suggest this, is it's partly economics, it's partly technical fields, it's partly science, it's partly governance and foreign policy and diplomacy. That is what you have to do to make these institutions work effectively.
It's basically a supplier of public goods. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Hong Zhang. I'm formerly Caixin correspondent, but now I'm with George Mason University. So my question to President Zolik is that to follow up on your vision of turning the bank into a knowledge-sharing entity instead of lending institution, and also to engage middle-income countries, I was just wondering, to what extent do you think there's a consensus among all the major stakeholders in terms of what's the best practice or approach to development? Apparently, China's model is more top-down, but World Bank has been championing a more bottom-up process, emphasizing community-driven development. So what happens when there's a clash of ideas? For example, if World Bank and AIIB going into co-funding an infrastructure project, and the AIIB wants it to be quick, efficient, but the World Bank has been, would be probably emphasizing a lot about, consulting the civil society, community-driven, and negotiating, collaborating with all these local communities, and that will be time-consuming and probably also costly. So what happens in this scenario?
Well, it's a good question, and there are different dimensions of it. Let me take the most basic one that you focused on. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm just an observer. What I've watched President Jin do is that he's basically set up the AIB as a co-financing facility, okay? And he's keeping expenses down by not building the analytical staff that I described, okay? Now, that's okay because it actually complements the bank, and what most of his funding projects have been co-funded projects, whether with the bank or the Asian Development Bank and others. So that doesn't mean he's ignoring the standards. They have the standards. He's kind of leveraging the analytical staffs that exist. Now, somebody has to pay for those analytical staffs, okay? And that's where the lending and the lending revenues from the bank basically do is pay for the staff. And so the capital sort of exists. And again, this gets a little more complicated with trust funds and sort of other arrangements. But so in that sense, it's a network of institutions where the AIB is leveraging off some of this capacity that exists elsewhere. So I don't see them in conflict. I see them more as a complementary nature, but it is important to recognize that somebody, if you're going to add this knowledge capacity that I've talked about, you do have to have that exists somewhere. But I would expand it. You see, when I started at the bank, I was somewhat surprised at the lack of interaction with the regional development banks. And to be honest, one of the interesting things about the whole bank too is some of this requires some executive role. It's not just economics policy. One of the things that I learned was that we would disqualify people for various violations of corruption or ethics rules, but the regional banks might do business with them. So I got all the regional bank presidents together, and we all agreed if one dispars, we all dispar. Okay, and we started to figure out more ways that sort of we could cooperate together. And so on some of the climate change or some of the environmental issues, you might have the African Development Bank play a certain role in the environmental area, and we'd play a supportive role. Or in other ones, sort of the World Bank would would take the lead. The World Bank has the advantage, and this is one of the interesting things about the development field. It has the advantage that because it's global, it can take experiences, say, in conditional cash transfer programs in Mexico, which then were spent to Brazil, and bring them to Egypt when it's trying to do it. And just as an example, when I left, we had those in 45 different countries. And again, what was impressive was when we'd go to country X or Y or Z or Z, whatever you want to say, and say, look, you may want to look at this. It wasn't just a textbook. We could put them together with the people in Mexico that had done the Oportunidades program. And so they could learn what's the practical problems that you sort of be able to get to do with this. If you're in one region, you may not get that sort of global nature. And just to expand on this point, because actually I just got a message, this was part of a World Bank IEG study, the internal evaluation group. When I left the bank, there was a recognition that knowledge was important, okay? And so, and this is where, to be honest, it drives me crazy when you bring in outside consultants that don't really understand the institutions. So they brought in McKinsey and they said, oh, well, okay, knowledge is more important than regional stuff, okay? So let's put, you have a matrix. You got regional and you got knowledge, okay? And so therefore, and you have support. And so let's put, in a sense, the primary decision-making role in the knowledge set of networks. This is a problem, again, if you've been in the private sector, you can organize by product, you can organize by client, you can organize by geography. It's not an unknown problem. But in the private sector, you got a bottom line that forces some discipline. You don't have that discipline in a public institution like the World Bank unless you put the relationship close with the client. This goes back to my conversation with Marcus. So what I recognize of the World Bank is that if I didn't keep the country directors and regional directors serving the client closely, because that's the real ultimate answer to your question about what you choose, then we risked having very smart people who could be professors somewhere doing their own analytical work in Washington that was disconnected, okay? So you need that analytical work and you need to move it from the region. But if you disconnect from the client relationships, you're going to become more likely to be an ivory tower outside of that. And, you know, shock, this internal evaluation report 7 years later comes up and says, oh yes, the big restructuring done of this actually wasn't very successful. I could have told them that 7 years ago, but you know, McKinsey's McKinsey. And so they looked at it from a private sector point of view without understanding public institutions. So part of what's interesting here is that these multilateral institutions, you know, they do operate with a different set of incentives and structures and other points. But one last point on your issue, because again, I found it intriguing. What I thought you were going to focus on, and this is one of my frustrations with the development economics profession, is the great hot thing now is sort of controlled lab experiments, okay? And so you know, everybody getting their PhD has to do their controlled experiment, right? So I have an interest in analytical work and academic work. So, you know, I then would talk to these people and say, okay, now could I apply this to country A or B or C? And they say, oh, no, if you change this variable, we can't be comfortable, okay? Here's the reality. People like me or Malpass or Kristalina, you sit down with prime ministers, you sit down with finance ministers, you're trying to figure out what to do. Zhu Min was talking about this in China. You need answers. I can't just talk about, well, here's a controlled experiment that may or may not work, okay? So my point to the development profession, and I know why this happened, because there was an earlier phase, you know, sort of going back to stages of growth and Walt Rostow, that people kind of thought these were too big, these sort of schematic ideas. So instead, they've retreated to the micro. And to be honest, it's their competition with physics. And so, you know, that's the problem that I'm trying to argue in the development profession. See the interconnections, do the good research, but sort of make sure you try to understand how you connect the dots. And here I compliment the Peterson Institute. That's been the nature of the work that Fred started.
Well, I think you can see from that answer why Bob was such an effective diplomat. That was the most polite description of free riding I've ever heard. You can see why when he became president of the World Bank, he terrorized the sleepy bureaucrats within the bank. I was hearing all these screams coming out of the building about this guy had a BlackBerry and he was like, hitting them with these telegraphic, messages, every few minutes, asking them, why
the
they
screams changed when I left.
why they weren't doing their jobs. And the one thing I did not expect to hear when I came in here this afternoon was Bob to reveal the secret that PhD economists are basically a bunch of closet physicists who just weren't good enough at math to actually make it as physicists. So we could go on for hours, but we promised people that we would get out of here at I've been told that we don't have to get out of here. We've gotten a reprieve. So if there are more questions, we can entertain some more questions, please. And if not, I will ask my own questions. Yes.
Pega with China Xinhua News Agency. I'm wondering what's your take on the current China-US trade talks, particularly on the two aspects. First, whether the trade talks could help the US-China to set up some kind of temporary or permanent framework to resolve the trade disputes. Secondly, whether the trade talks could help push for the reform of the WTO. Thank you.
There was one other question. Let's take it now, and then we really will call it quits. We got in a couple bonus questions. There was another young lady who wanted to, yep, please ask your question. And then we'll wrap it up.
Thanks. Miao from Bloomberg. I have a question about China's Belt and Road Initiative. It seems like China wants to make change to that project. So what are the changes you think China needs to make, and what are the difficulties for China to realize those changes?
Okay, these questions are nicely related. On your question about the trade talks, you could do this narrow and you can do it big. I'll do a little combination. Look, unfortunately, but I think it's important to acknowledge, particularly for a group like Caixin, the U.S. attitude towards China these days in the larger Washington policy community is sour at best. Okay, it's highly negative. And as I've tried to understand this, I think there's a convergence of a number of issues. One, there's what we'll call the traditional market access. Tariffs, ability to invest, joint ventures, IPR, forced technology transfer. Some of those issues will be dealt with in the negotiation. Second, and it's related to the first, but it's a little separate, is the fear that China has a state capitalist model. So it's beyond subsidies, but is this model in some way disadvantage fair international competition? This was a form of Fred's question, but just as Fred suggested, there's an oddity in this in that the state capitalist model doesn't seem to be as effective, so I'm not quite so sure why everybody's so worried about it, other than it's going to slow down growth, but it does create questions of lack of competition. Third, there's the Made in China 2025 initiative, which, by the way, may just be a framework that one ministry put over it, but the main point was, will China take over the technologies of the future? Then fourth, there's Belt and Road. And the question is it a geopolitical venture? Is it a development project? Is it to use excess capacity? Fifth is the foreign policy issues of, Deng Xiaoping's bide their time, hide their strength is clearly beyond. And then sixth is this issue that bothers a lot of Americans that believe technology should be liberating. And frankly, they look at how technology is used for social control, or they look at the things where you have work camps for 1 million people in Zhejiang province, and it bothers them. So you got 6 different things. One thing is for sure, focusing on the bilateral trade deficit is not going to address those problems, and tariffs won't address those problems, okay? So to go to the narrow part, if I were going to guess, I think that both China and the Trump administration would like to have some resolution, because Trump is concerned about markets, and every time there's a uncertainty about whether there'll be additional trade conflict, markets don't like it, and he's now looking for his reelection. On the other hand, he is a protectionist. He does believe in tariffs, and his chief negotiator so in this area wants an enforcement mechanism that is going to be hard for China to accept. which is basically he wants the ability to retaliate whenever he wants on his own terms. And that not only kind of doesn't seem reciprocal, but it may trigger Chinese concerns about unequal treaties and so on and so forth. So my guess is they will reach a deal. It'll be a little longer than people expect. It'll be a combination of purchases, which allow Trump to trumpet purchases, but they're not going to affect the fundamental issues. Some of the market access issues, and not really a lot of the other questions that I mentioned. That means you're going to have an ongoing challenge here. It'll be more of a pause in the nature of the relationship. And some of the work, actually, we'll talk about at the board meeting for PIIE next week is how can PIIE and others contribute to kind of trying to figure out how can you most effectively address some of those other issues. And this is what sort of Fred has spent much of the past years seeking to do. And it's why he was asked Zhu Min the question he did.
Well, that has been absolutely fantastic. It's been an enormous honor to have you here this afternoon. Please join me in thanking Robert Zoellick for just an extraordinary kind of master class in international financial diplomacy.